I wanted to talk really quick about appraised value versus market value because there are two different kinds of value in real estate. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference because I was at a listing appointment today and this property just was the perfect example of why there is the difference between appraised value and market value. Sorry, I'm coming at you in a t-shirt today. It was 116 degrees and I was running around outside on a half-acre property. So I immediately peeled off my professional clothing. So this is what we get today. Anyway, so this property that is going to be coming on the market soon, I put some information in my stories about it. It is located in this really cool sort of niche part of Northwest Phoenix, Glendale area. So a lot of you may know Arrowhead. It's very close to that. It's a neighborhood that has a lot of properties that are on larger lots. They are typically ranch homes, very solid construction, bigger lots, RV gates, RV parking. Just a lot of elbow room in those areas to spread out, but they are right off Union Hills, very close to the 101 and the highway, super close to shopping, restaurants, very easy to hop over to the 17. So it's just a very convenient location, even though you're getting this bigger lot, a lot of space. And so these houses are on the market for a very short period of time. In fact, our clients were telling us a story today about one of their neighbors who was selling a house in that neighborhood. And there were multiple people who were interested in buying it. It was on the market for 3 days. And one person missed out on a bidding war on the property and actually somehow, I do not know how, was able to contact the buyer of the property and tried to offer them like $20,000 to back out of the deal. Anyway, just, crazy stories. Okay. So, that just kind of emphasizes the point of how high and in demand this particular small niche neighborhood is in this area, and the houses that are surrounding it are in PUDs, typically planned urban developments, and it's beautiful. The homes around it and the neighborhoods around it are also beautiful, but it's just very rare a lot of times in Arizona, especially with in the loop, in the 101, to find properties that are on larger lots like that. And so it creates a lot of demand, and people watch that neighborhood, and when things come on the market, then they jump on it. And so but you still have X amount of land and Y amount of square footage, and you have granite countertops or no granite countertops, and you have all of the same variables of a property, right? And so it creates a situation where you have some houses that are worth X amount of dollars to an appraiser, but they might be able to sell for a lot more money than that. So you have this discrepancy between appraised value and market value being what a buyer is willing to pay for it. So what happens when we have a discrepancy between those two values? A couple of things. One, if the buyer of the property is purchasing the property using a loan, this is going to affect their ability to get a loan, because the loan that they're getting is based on a loan to value, ding, 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 value being the critical part here, ratio, right? So how much are they borrowing compared to how much is the property worth? That's a loan to value ratio. And that number is based on the appraisal, not based on what buyers are willing to pay for it. It's based on the appraisal. So at that point, the buyer and the seller have an opportunity to negotiate. And this would be true as well, even if you had a cash buyer. So some cash buyers elect to not get an appraisal on a property because it makes their offer more appealing to the seller, especially when we're in a seller's market like we are now. Other times they can use an addendum, and they can essentially be doing a cash offer but still make the appraisal contingency a valid part of the contract. So you can still have an appraisal contingency or have an appraisal with a cash offer. So regardless, if you're in this situation, the buyer and the seller have the ability to negotiate. Now, the buyer can still buy the property and get a loan. It's just that the difference between the appraised value and the sale price has to get made up with cash. So if you have a buyer who has a lot of cash on hand and is willing to put that cash down on the property, then they can go ahead and make up the difference. The seller can also reduce the sale price to match the appraisal value, or some combination there in between. Sometimes if there are seller concessions happening, you can go ahead and drop the seller concessions and then reduce the listing price. And there's all different ways to negotiate, depending on what the terms of the contract were surrounding that. So there's going to be some kind of negotiation, and the buyer doesn't have to buy it at the higher price. Likewise, the seller doesn't have to sell it at the lower price. The seller could put it back on the market and wait for a buyer to come along who can make up the difference or who's willing to pay in cash. Because when you have properties like that are really high in demand, that very well may be the case that in the next day, the next week, the next month, there's a buyer that comes along that does fit that profile. So at that point, what are the considerations for the buyer? Well, at the point that they've done the appraisal, the buyer has already paid for a home inspection on the property, which is probably $400 plus or minus, right? If they've done any other inspections, roof inspection, septic, if they have done, scoping of the plumbing, that's $250 right there. So they've gone through their inspection period before they've gotten to the appraisal period, typically in a typical process. And so the buyer then is just out that money. So this is a great example of why it's really important, if you are using a loan, to try to price the property. And you could be super in love with a property, but you have to know what your financial position is so that you can anticipate this. Because in that particular scenario, if they were not able to come to terms, then the buyer would just be out the hundreds of dollars that they have spent, in addition to the amount they paid for the appraisal, which is probably $500, plus or minus. That's a lot of money to be out as a buyer. So these things are really, really, really important to think about. And it's extremely important to work with your realtor, to get these numbers, to think through these scenarios on the property, to understand, what's going on, and to think through the next 6 steps, so that you are, of course, there's no guarantee, that you're not going to ever lose any money, but it's important to think, 6 steps ahead so that you can try to minimize losses, and to be making smart offers when you're a buyer. And then similarly, if you're a seller, when you're pricing a property, you need to think about that. So, you can absolutely list over what we think it's going to appraise for, and look for that buyer. You just have to understand that's going to affect your time on market, because you're going to be waiting for a more particular buyer, right? And you have to weigh those pros and cons, right? Between wanting to get market value for something versus knowing that a certain percentage of your buyers, depending on where the home is and what kind of home it is, could be buyers that are using loans. So if it's a more of a luxury property, then this may not be as much of a factor because so many of your buyers are going to be cash. So it really just depends what the situation is.